think you know the worst cults in history. Jonestown, Heaven's Gate. But some of the most chilling and deadly cults never made into national headlines. Today we're exposing 3 terrifying cults that operated in complete darkness while the world wasn't watching. What you're about to hear will disturb you to your core. Our first story takes us to rural Uganda in the 1980s. Joseph Kibwetia was a respected school administrator and devout Catholic who began having what he called divine visions. He claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to him, warning that the world was corrupt and the apocalypse was coming. But Kibwetia wasn't alone in his revelations. Credonia Mwerindi was a former bar owner and mother of several children who also claimed to receive visions from the Virgin Mary. When these two met, they formed a deadly partnership that would destroy over 1,000 lives. Together, they founded the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God in 1989. The cult's rules were extreme from the beginning. Members were forbidden to speak except during prayer, because human speech was considered sinful. They communicated through hand signals and whispers. Sex was completely banned, even between married couples. Children were separated from their parents and raised communally. Members had to fast for days at a time to purify their souls. But here's what made this cult particularly insidious. They didn't just isolate people spiritually, they isolated them financially. New members were required to sell everything they owned and donate the proceeds to the cult. Families sold their homes, their farmland, their cattle, everything that represented their life's work. Once they had nothing left, leaving became impossible. The leaders preached that the world would end on December 31st, 1999. As the date approached, members became increasingly fanatical. They stopped planting crops because they believed they wouldn't need food after the apocalypse. Children stopped attending school. The outside world ceased to exist for these people. But when January 1st, 2000 came and the world didn't end, something shifted. Members began asking questions. They wanted their money back. They wanted to leave. Some started secretly planning escapes. The leaders realized they were losing control, and that's when they made a horrifying decision. On March 17, 2000, over 500 members gathered in the cult's main church for what they thought was a special prayer service. The leaders told them they were finally going to be taken to heaven. But what happened next was pure evil. The windows and doors were nailed shut from the outside. Gasoline was poured around the building. The church was set on fire, with everyone inside. Those who tried to escape were forced back into the flames. Mothers held their children as they burned alive. The screams could be heard for miles, but by the time help arrived,
the horror didn't end there. As police investigated other cults' properties, they found mass graves everywhere. Bodies buried in gardens, under houses, in remote fields. Many showed signs of torture and strangulation. The total death count exceeded 1,000 people, including hundreds of children. This wasn't just mass murder, it was genocide on a horrific scale. Our second story takes us to the remote wilderness of Ontario, Canada, where one of the most sadistic cult leaders in history operated for nearly a decade. Rock Therio was a charismatic carpenter who convinced a small group of followers that he was a prophet sent by God to prepare them for the end times. Therio called his group the Anthill Kids, and he ruled them with absolute terror. He controlled when they ate, when they slept, when they spoke, even when they used the bathroom. Members had to ask permission for everything, and punishment for breaking rules was swift and brutal. But what made Therio particularly dangerous was his medical delusions. He believed God had given him the power to heal through surgery, even though he had no medical training whatsoever. Using kitchen knives and farming tools, he performed horrific operations on his followers without anesthesia. One woman, Gabrielle Lavallee was forced to endure multiple surgeries. Therio removed 8 of her teeth with pliers because she spoke without permission. He sliced open her stomach and paid of her intestines while she was conscious. He amputated her arm with a chainsaw, others claiming it was infected. Somehow she survived years of this torture. Children in the cult faced unimaginable abuse. Therio forced them to break their own bones with hammers as punishment. He made them sit naked in freezing temperatures for hours. He performed circumcisions on young boys using broken glass. Several children died from his medical experiments, and their bodies were buried around the property. The most disturbing aspect was how Therio maintained psychological control. He convinced his followers that their suffering was holy, that God was testing their faith through pain. He alternated between extreme violence and moments of apparent kindness, creating a trial bond that made escape seem impossible. For 8 years, this torture continued in complete isolation. The cult lived on a remote property with no neighbors for miles. When authorities occasionally received reports of strange activities, Therio was charming and persuasive during visits. He convinced investigators that his followers were happy religious people living off the land. It only ended in 1989 when Gabrielle Lavallee finally escaped and went to police with detailed evidence of the abuse. Her missing arm and horrific scars were impossible to deny. Even then, Therio was initially sentenced only 12 years in prison. He was eventually killed by another inmate in 2011.
Our final story takes us to Brazil, where a cult called Superior Universal Alignment committed crimes so horrific that local authorities actively covered them up. The cult was led by Valentina de Andrade, a former radio host who claimed to be in contact with superior beings from other dimensions. De Andrade preached that the earth was being invaded by demons who reincarnated as human children. These evil children could be identified by specific physical characteristics: blue eyes, fair skin, certain birthmarks, or unusual behavior. She convinced her followers that these children had to be eliminated to save humanity. The cult established a base in Altamira, a remote city in the Amazon region where they could operate without oversight. Between 1989 and 1993, 19 children between the ages of 8 and 13 disappeared from the area. All of them fit the physical description that de Andrade claimed identified demon children. The children weren't just killed, they were ritually mutilated. Their bodies were found with organs removed, genitals cut off, and strange symbols carved into their skin. The cult believed that by torturing these children, they could prevent the demons from reincarnating again. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the level of official corruption involved. Several local police officers and government officials were reportedly members of the cult. When families reported missing children, investigations were deliberately sabotaged. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. The case only gained attention when a federal investigator named Pedrino Bertolucci arrived from outside the region. He immediately recognized the pattern of ritual murders and began building a case against the cult. But by then, de Andrade had fled to Argentina, where she continued operating under a different name. Even more shocking, the cult had wealthy and influential members throughout Brazil. They operated legal businesses and charitable organizations as fronts for their activities. Some members held positions in local government, which explained how they avoided prosecution for so long. De Andrade was never extradited or prosecuted for the murders. She died in Argentina in 2005, still claiming to be in contact with superior beings. Many of her followers scattered to other countries, and some are believed to still be active today. So, what makes these cults so dangerous? They all share common patterns that we need to recognize. First, they target vulnerable people during life transitions. Second, they promise simple answers to complex problems. Third, they gradually isolate members from outside support systems. Most importantly, they operate in places where oversight is weak and victims have no voice. Remote locations, poor communities, regions with corrupt authorities. They deliberately choose victims who won't be missed or whose disappearances won't be thoroughly investigated.
These stories didn't make international headlines because they happened to people society had already forgotten. But that silence is exactly what allows these groups to thrive. When we don't talk about the warning signs, we leave people vulnerable to the same manipulation. Right now, somewhere in the world, another charismatic leader is gathering followers. Another isolated community is forming. And without awareness, these horrors will happen again. The most dangerous cults are the ones nobody talks about. Subscribe if you want to keep exposing the stories that never make headlines. Because the truth doesn't disappear just because the world doesn't